In 1815, a London dockworker earned about 15 shillings a week. He paid tax on his bread, his beer, his soap, his candles, and his tea. Across town, a banker named Nathan Mayer Rothschild held British government bonds worth millions. The dockworkers' tax money flowed directly into Rothschild's pocket as interest payments for the next 40 years. The dockworker fought no war. He signed no treaty. He attended no parliament. Yet he funded the defeat of Napoleon for the rest of his life, and so did his children, and his grandchildren after them. This is the oldest financial trick in recorded history. You have been taught that wars are paid for by nations. They are not. Wars are paid for by specific people inside those nations, and the people who pay are almost never the people who profit. Welcome to Noob Historian. Behind every headline in your history book, there's a ledger they kept hidden. We open it. Today, you will see the exact mechanism used to shift the cost of every major war in the last 2,000 years onto wage earners, small farmers, savers, and unborn taxpayers. You will see the receipts. You will see the names. And by the end, you will recognize the same pattern operating in your own paycheck right now. Start in Rome, because Rome wrote the manual. When Augustus took power in 27 BCE, the silver denarius contained roughly 95% pure silver. A Roman legionary earned 225 denarii per year, and those coins held their weight. A farmer in Campania, who sold his grain for denarii, held real silver in his hand. Savings meant something. Then Rome went to war and kept going to war. The frontier campaigns under Trajan, the Parthian Wars under Marcus Aurelius, the civil wars of the 3rd century, and the constant pressure on the Rhine and Danube borders demanded soldiers, and soldiers demanded pay. The Roman treasury faced a problem familiar to every government since. Tax revenue from the senatorial class arrived slowly, grudgingly, and with endless legal exemptions. The great landowners of Italy controlled the Senate, and the Senate controlled tax policy. Direct taxation of Roman citizens in Italy had been abolished in 167 BCE after the conquest of Macedonia, and the senatorial elite intended to keep it that way. So the emperors found another route. They debased the currency. Under Nero in 64 CE, the silver content of the denarius dropped to about 90%. Under Trajan, it slipped to 85%. Under Marcus Aurelius, it fell below 75%. By the reign of Septimius Severus, who needed funds for his eastern campaigns and to pay his legions a 50% raise, the denarius held barely 50% silver. By 268 CE, under Gallienus, the coin contained less than 5% silver, coated in a thin silver wash that wore off within months of circulation. The numismatic analysis by Kenneth Harl in Coinage and the Roman Economy documents every step of this collapse, coin by coin, hoard by hoard. The Roman Imperial Coinage series catalogs the physical evidence. Thousands of surviving coins showing the steady evaporation of real value. Who lost? The legionary who saved his pay, the widow who buried a jar of coins for her old age, the small merchant who held cash between transactions, the grain farmer who sold his harvest in autumn and tried to live on the proceeds through winter. Every person whose wealth existed as coined money watched that wealth dissolve. Who won? The state, which paid its debts in lighter coins. The great landowners, whose wealth sat in land, slaves, olive groves, and grain stores, all of which held value while the currency collapsed. The tax farmers, who collected in kind and paid the treasury in debased coin. The senators, who held estates across multiple provinces, and who borrowed heavily in denarii to be repaid in denarii, worth a fraction of their original value. The Edict of Diocletian in 301 CE attempted to freeze prices by imperial decree, threatening death for merchants who raised them. The edict failed within years. You cannot legislate away inflation when the cause of inflation is the government itself. This is seigniorage warfare. The state finances its wars by manufacturing money, the money loses value, and the loss falls on whoever holds the money. Landholders are insulated. Bondholders, when bonds exist, often hold claims indexed to harder assets. Wage earners and small savers absorb the entire impact. Rome taught the world this lesson. Every government since has studied it. Jump forward 18 centuries to London, 1793. Revolutionary France has declared war on Britain. William Pitt the Younger, Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, faces a question every wartime leader faces. Who pays? Pitt had options. He could raise direct taxes on land, which would hit the aristocracy and the gentry who dominated Parliament. He could impose a wealth tax on the merchant class growing rich in Bristol, Liverpool, and the City of London. He could levy customs duties on the luxury imports consumed by the wealthy. He chose none of these as his primary tool. Instead, he chose debt. The Bank of England archive, in Ledger Book C98, series numbers 1 through 47, documents the exact mechanism. Pitt's government issued consols, perpetual bonds paying 3% interest, sold to wealthy investors in London and Amsterdam. The proceeds funded the war against Napoleon. The interest payments became a permanent claim on future British tax revenue. By 1815, when Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, The British national debt had reached approximately 260% of GDP. This was the largest debt-to-output ratio in British history until that point, and it would not be matched until the Second World War. Pitt did introduce an income tax in 1799, the first in British history, set at 10% on incomes above £200. Parliament repealed it in 1816, immediately after the war ended, at the insistence of the propertied classes. The records were physically burned to prevent its revival. The debt, however, remained. Who held that debt? Examine the bondholder rolls preserved in the Bank of England archives. You find members of Parliament, peers of the realm, city bankers including the Baring and Rothschild houses, country gentry, Anglican bishops, and the trustees of Oxford and Cambridge colleges. The same men who voted for the wars held the bonds that financed the wars and collected the interest paid by ordinary British taxpayers for the next century. How did ordinary Britons pay that interest? Through indirect taxes. Taxes on beer, on salt, on soap, on candles, on tea, on sugar, on tobacco, on printed paper, on glass, on bricks, on windows. The window tax, in force from 1696 until 1851, taxed houses based on the number of windows, leading thousands of working-class landlords to brick up windows in tenement buildings. You find the bricked-up windows across Britain today, physical monuments to war finance. The economist Thomas Piketty, working with French and British tax records, calculated that debt service consumed between 40 and 50% of total British government spending throughout the 19th century. Half of every tax shilling collected from a Manchester millworker or a Welsh coal miner flowed to bondholders. The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. The bonds that funded them were still paying interest in 1914, when Britain entered the next Great War and started the cycle over again. Some of those original consols were not fully redeemed until 2015. A British taxpayer in the 21st century paid interest on debt issued to fight Napoleon. Let that settle. This is the second mechanism. Issue long-dated debt to wealthy buyers, then service that debt through regressive consumption taxes on the working population for generations. The war is fought once, the bill is paid forever. April 1917. The United States enters the First World War. Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo faces the same question Pitt faced. Who pays? McAdoo designed a system of staggering elegance. He called it the Liberty Loan Program. Between 1917 and 1919, the Treasury ran 4 Liberty Loan drives and 1 Victory Loan drive, raising approximately $21 billion. To put that in scale, total U.S. federal spending in 1916 had been about $700 million. The Liberty loans represented 30 times the entire pre-war federal budget. The marketing was masterful. Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks toured the country selling bonds. Boy Scouts went door to door. School children bought 25-cent thrift stamps. Posters showed German soldiers bayoneting babies above the caption, "Buy bonds." The message, patriotic Americans invest in their country. U.S. National Archives. Record Group 56, the Treasury Department records, preserves the distributional data. Examine who bought the bonds. The middle class bought them. School teachers, clerks, small farmers, factory foremen, shopkeepers. They bought bonds yielding 3.5 to 4.25% interest, locking up their savings for 10 to 30 years. The ultra-wealthy participated, but in a different role. They underwrote the bond issues through their banks, collecting fees. J.P. Morgan and Company alone handled British and French war loans worth over $3 billion before American entry, earning commissions on every transaction. After American entry, the Morgan partners, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, and the Mellons positioned themselves on the production side. DuPont supplied 40% of all Allied propellant powder. Bethlehem Steel quadrupled its profits. USO Steel doubled its dividend. Congress responded with the Revenue Act of 1917 and the War Revenue Act of 1918, raising the top marginal income tax rate to 77%. On paper, this looked like wealth taxation on an unprecedented scale. The implementation told a different story. John Kenneth Galbraith's Money Whence It Came, Where It Went, published in 1975, documents the gap between statutory rates and effective rates. Randolph Paul's earlier work, Taxation in the United States, published in 1954, drew on congressional testimony and Treasury data to reach the same conclusion. The wealthy had access to depletion allowances for oil and mineral holdings, capital gains treatment for asset sales, tax-exempt municipal bonds, corporate retention of earnings, and family trust structures that reduced effective rates far below the published numbers. The Senate Finance Committee hearings of 1942 through 1944, preserved in the congressional record, document the same pattern during the Second World War. Statutory top rate of 94%, effective rate on the top 0.1%, substantially lower, by some estimates closer to 50% after exemptions and shelters. Meanwhile, the bonds purchased by middle-class Americans paid fixed nominal interest. Inflation during and after the First World War reached approximately 17% in 1917 and again in 1918. The real value of bond principal eroded. The school teacher who bought a $100 bond in 1917 received back in 1937 purchasing power somewhere between $50 and $60 of real value, plus interest that often failed to match inflation. Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez, in their 2019 work, The Triumph of Injustice, using the WID, World Database compiled at the Paris School of Economics, document the same phenomenon for the Second World War. The wealth redistribution that occurred between 1914 and 1945, often credited to progressive taxation, came primarily from two sources: physical destruction of European capital during combat, and inflation eroding the real value of fixed income assets held by the middle class. Voluntary or enforced wealth taxation played a smaller role than the textbook narrative suggests. The Liberty Bond model gave the state a financing tool the Roman emperors would have envied. Citizens hand over their savings voluntarily, motivated by patriotic appeal. The state spends the money on war contracts that flow to industrial elites. Inflation erodes the real cost of repayment. The wealthy avoid the high statutory taxes through legal structures. The middle class loses real purchasing power. The poor, who hold no bonds and have no savings, lose their sons. Money is one form of war finance. Bodies are another. Any serious accounting of who pays for war must include the regressive tax of conscription. In every major conscripted war of the modern era, the burden of military service fell disproportionately on the poor. The mechanisms varied, the outcome remained constant. During the American Civil War, the Enrollment Act of 1863 permitted draftees to hire substitutes or pay a $300 commutation fee. A skilled worker in New York City earned roughly $500 per year. The fee represented 7 months of wages. The wealthy paid the fee or hired substitutes from the immigrant poor. The New York draft riots of July 1863 erupted in direct response to this two-tier system, with Irish workers attacking conscription offices under the slogan that became famous, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight." The Union ultimately drafted only about 2% of its forces directly. The bounty system, however, paid substantial cash sums to volunteers, drawing recruits from the poorest urban districts and recently arrived immigrants. Confederate conscription exempted owners of 20 or more slaves under the 20-slave law of 1862, formalizing class exemption in statute. During the First World War, the United States drafted 2.8 million men. The Selective Service Act of 1917 eliminated the substitution and commutation provisions of 1863, but the deferment system replaced them. Agricultural workers in essential production, industrial workers in war plants, and married men with dependents received deferments. The pattern: men with capital, education, and connections found their way into officer training programs, technical services, or essential industries. Men without those advantages went to the trenches. During the Vietnam War, the deferment system reached its most documented inequity. College students received automatic 2S deferments, available primarily to those who could afford university tuition. Medical exemptions required access to physicians willing to document conditions. The result, documented by sociologist Christian Appy in Working Class War, was a combat force in Vietnam composed approximately 80% of working class and poor Americans. The sons of senators, executives, and professionals largely avoided combat. The sons of mill workers, farmers, and clerks fought and died. Conscription is a tax. The state extracts labor from the population without market compensation. When that extraction falls disproportionately on one economic class, it functions as a regressive tax of the most extreme kind. The currency is not dollars, but years of life, limbs, and bodies. Add this to the ledger. The financial cost of war shifted to wage earners through inflation and debt service. The human cost shifted to the same class through selective conscription. The wealthy avoided both burdens through legal structures and social positioning available only to those with capital and connections. The Romans understood this too. The Roman legions of the late Republic and early Empire drew increasingly from the rural poor and the provinces. The senatorial class served as officers briefly to qualify for political office. The plebeian conscripts served 20 years, often dying on frontiers their commanders would never see. The pattern is not modern. The pattern is human. For the first time in modern American history, the United States cut taxes while initiating major wars. The wars were financed entirely by borrowing. Who bought that debt? Foreign central banks, particularly China and Japan, purchased treasury securities in large volume. Domestic institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals purchased the remainder. The interest payments on that debt now consume a growing share of federal spending, projected by the CBO to exceed defense spending entirely by the late 2020s. The Federal Reserve participated through quantitative easing programs, initiated after 2008, and expanded dramatically during the 2020 pandemic response. The Fed purchased Treasury securities and mortgage-backed assets, expanding its balance sheet from approximately $900 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion by 2022. This monetary expansion, combined with pandemic fiscal spending, contributed to the inflation surge of 2021 through 2023, which peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. The distributional effect mirrors every prior episode in this script. Asset holders, those owning stocks, real estate, and businesses, saw portfolio values rise substantially between 2009 and 2024. The S&P 500 increased approximately sixfold over that period. Real estate values in major metropolitan areas doubled or tripled. Wage earners and savers experienced the opposite. Real wages stagnated for most of the period. Cash savings lost approximately 18% of purchasing power during the 2021 to 2023 inflation surge alone. The Roman pattern, the Napoleonic pattern, the Liberty Bond pattern. Reproduced in living memory, documented in real time by the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Brown University Costs of War Project. The mechanism updated for the digital age, the outcome identical to the Denarius debasement of 268 CE. You paid for these wars. You're paying for them now. You will pay for them for the rest of your working life and your children after you. The interest on the post-9/11 war debt will outlive everyone watching this video. Step back from the individual cases and see the structure. Across 2,000 years of documented war finance, four mechanisms repeat: currency debasement and inflation, debt issuance serviced by regressive taxation, voluntary bond purchases by the middle class whose real value erodes, and conscription falling disproportionately on the poor. Each mechanism transfers cost from capital holders to wage earners and savers. Each mechanism operates under cover of patriotic appeal. Each mechanism is documented in primary sources, accessible to anyone willing to read them. The beneficiaries cluster into recognizable categories: defense contractors and war suppliers, from the Roman Publicani to DuPont to modern aerospace firms. Financial institutions underwriting government debt, from Italian merchant banks to the House of Morgan to today's primary dealers in U.S. Treasury auctions. Large landowners and asset holders whose wealth holds value through inflation while currency-denominated savings collapse. Bondholders collecting interest paid by ordinary taxpayers through consumption taxes and income taxes for generations after the war ends. The losers cluster equally clearly: wage earners whose nominal wages lag inflation, savers whose currency-denominated holdings erode, small farmers and shopkeepers caught between rising input costs and price controls, conscripts drawn from the working class who fight the actual battles, future taxpayers who service debt incurred before they were born. This pattern does not require conspiracy. It requires only that policy be made by people who hold capital, in consultation with people who hold capital for the benefit of institutions controlled by people who hold capital. The outcomes follow naturally from the incentive structure. The senators who voted for Roman wars held the land. The MPs who voted for Pitt's wars held the bonds. The legislators who voted for the Iraq War held the stocks of the contractors who built it. What you do with this knowledge depends on you. Recognize the pattern when politicians announce that a new conflict will be paid for by the wealthy through new taxes. Check the implementation against the rhetoric 6 months later. Track who buys the debt issued to finance the war. Track which industries see profit increases. Track the inflation rate over the following decade. Track which assets appreciate and which depreciate. The data is public. The Treasury publishes auction results. The BLS publishes inflation numbers. Corporate earnings reports are public filings. Recognize the same pattern in your own household finances. If you hold cash savings during a period of monetary expansion, you are paying a tax. If you hold long-dated fixed-rate bonds during a period of accelerating inflation, you are paying a tax. If you hold no appreciating assets during a period of asset inflation, you're losing relative ground, even if your nominal wages rise. These are not opinions. These are arithmetic. The wealthy of every era have understood these mechanisms intuitively because their position required them to. The Roman senator held land, not coin. The London banker of 1810 held real estate and indexed claims, not paper money. The American industrialist of 1942 held shares of companies producing for the government, not war bonds. The pattern of asset selection by elites during wartime is itself a record of which holdings survive and which do not. You now hold the same information. The question is what you do with it. The history they taught you in school presented wars as national struggles in which everyone sacrificed together. The financial records tell a different story. Some sacrificed savings, limbs, and lives. Others collected interest, dividends, and capital gains. The line between the two groups was rarely the line between citizen and foreigner, or between patriot and traitor. The line was the line between those who held capital and those who held only labor. 2,000 years of receipts confirm it. Rome to Washington, denarius to dollar, legionary to private first class. The names change. The mechanism does not. You have now seen the ledger they kept hidden. What you do with it from here is the only part of this story still unwritten. This was Noob Historian. Follow the money, trace the power. The history they never taught you is still being written, and now you know how to read it.